Hi everybody, and welcome back to my channel, or welcome for the first time, whatever the case may be. I've picked up quite a few subscribers since the last time I uploaded, so right off the bat I want to say a huge thank you to everyone for getting me all the way up to 2,000 subs. You guys have blown my mind, and I sincerely thank you. In my last video, I talked about one of my least favorite romance tropes, love triangles. If you haven't seen that video, link in the description. I'm quite proud of it. This time, though, to balance things out, I thought I'd talk about one of my favorite romance tropes, which, as you probably guessed by the title, is enemies to lovers. And actually, I shouldn't even call it one of my favorite romance tropes. It is my favorite romance trope, and not even by a small margin. If I see a book advertising enemies to lovers, I will probably read it. The thing is, though, enemies to lovers is one of those tropes that's absolutely amazing when done well, but is easy to butcher if you haven't thought it through. So today I want to talk a little bit about the trope, the variations of it, the pros and cons, and address some criticisms that have been leveled at it over the years. Okay, let's get started. First, let's start with the basics. What is enemies to lovers? Well, the name is pretty self-explanatory, but an enemies to lovers tale is going to be one where the love interests start off opposing each other in some way, but through the events of the story end up in a romantic relationship. Enemies to lovers is a trope that comes in a few different flavors based on the level of conflict between the love interests, the most mundane of which is frenemies to lovers. These are the people who have no serious conflict between them, but got off on the wrong foot and therefore share a general dislike of one another, but they can still exist together in polite society. Think of people like Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice, or Alex and Henry from Red, White, and Royal Blue. A little side note when it comes to this one, if your character's dislike for one another is built on some kind of misunderstanding, you'll want to be careful not to make that the main conflict of your story, as it's a flimsy foundation and you risk making your characters look dumb or immature for not being able to sit down and talk things out. In Red, White, and Royal Blue, for example, the incident that got the leads off to a bad start is cleared up relatively early on, and the rest of the story is carried by other, more serious drama. Moving on, and upping the stakes a little, we now have rivals to lovers. Here, the conflict still isn't life or death, but the characters have been pitted against each other in competition, and they do have something real to lose. Like in You've Got Mail, where Kathleen Kelly risks losing her small business unless she can ward off Joe Fox and his mega-chain bookstore. Or in The Princess Diaries 2, where Mia and Nicholas both compete for the crown of Genovia. This category can also include characters who have no personal conflict with each other, but who have been thrust into a rivalry by being on opposing teams or in feuding families. Finally, we've got full-blown enemies to lovers. Here, the stakes might actually be life or death. It's not uncommon with this category for one or both love interests to start out actually trying to harm, capture, or even kill each other. This one is my favorite, by the way. Read into that what you will. This is the variation that's reserved for romances in more extreme genres such as fantasy, sci-fi, or action-adventure, where our suspension of disbelief is stronger anyway. Think examples like Belle and Beast from Beauty and the Beast, Buffy and Spike from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or Kylo Ren and Rey from Star Wars. So now that we've established the different categories, what are some advantages to writing an enemies to lovers story? Well, first there's the fact that all stories thrive on conflict. It's what drives them forward. And by writing enemies to lovers, you're immediately throwing your readers into a vat of tension between the main characters of the story. What would have happened in Pride and Prejudice if Darcy had been polite the first time he met Lizzie? Answer? Nothing. They just would have hung out up until the point Lydia decided to run away with Wickham, and even that might not have happened. By adding this level of conflict between your two leads, you can also flesh them out in a way you might not be able to with other tropes, since in this case their flaws are put on full display. This way the characters are forced to take a hard look at themselves and grapple with their worst faults in a way they otherwise wouldn't be, thus charting a clear path to the conclusion of their arc. The characters will also be made to prove themselves worthy in a way they otherwise wouldn't have to, because they do have to rub out the stain of a bad first impression or redeem themselves from past heinous actions. Enemies to lovers can also really work to heighten the romantic and sexual tension between your leads, since they'll spend so much time fighting against the growing attraction between them, and it makes for fertile ground when it comes to snarky or witty banter, which I know is one of my favorite aspects of the trope. With that said, as with any trope, there are also disadvantages to enemies to lovers. Many who dislike it will say it's overdone, and that's fair. Any trope can be overdone, and enemies to lovers is extremely prevalent amongst the romance genre. That said, this isn't so much a problem with the trope itself, but rather trends and readership. If you're someone who's sick of enemies to lovers, my advice is to read something else for a while. It might be popular, but it's still hardly the only romance trope out there, so just mix it up a little. And if you're a writer who feels compelled to write an enemies to lovers story just because they sell, don't. Tell the story you want to tell, regardless of popularity. I say this as someone who's currently working on a book of my own. If you are not truly passionate about the story you're writing, you will end up throwing it out the kitchen window for your neighbor's Rottweiler to eat. I feel like that was really specific, so just to be clear, I haven't done that with my manuscript. Yet. Another criticism I've seen leveled at the trope is that it's unrealistic, and to be honest, I don't really understand that one. If you're a reader of fiction, you would think you'd go into it with the understanding that not everything is going to be a reflection of reality. If that's what you want, then maybe give nonfiction a whirl. That said, I do understand that the ideas that we see in fiction can influence how we think about our reality, whether we're aware of it or not, which is why I'm a big fan of writing healthy romances and not glamorizing the unhealthy ones. Which brings me to what is by far the biggest criticism I see of the enemies to lovers trope, and that's that it's a trope that promotes toxic or even abusive relationships. And I do see where they're coming from with that. Particularly with the mortal enemies to lovers variant, you can risk promoting unhealthy or toxic behaviors if you're not careful. But this is where nuance comes in. And I know that's not something the internet is known for, nuance, but please hear me out. Going back to one of my examples from earlier, if Belle had fallen for Beast the second he took her captive in his castle, then yes, that would be a problem and an unhealthy relationship. But Belle doesn't develop feelings for him until after he's put in the work to redeem himself, and only enters into a relationship with him after he's set her free, and proven he'll put her needs and happiness before his own. Thus, they are able to begin their life together on even footing. The actions that Beast took before his character arc, like imprisoning Belle or withholding food from her, were also never framed as positive or justified in some way. Contrast that against something like Twilight, where Edward's stalking of Bella, breaking into her house, or sabotaging her truck to stop her from leaving, were seen as, at worst, a little weird, but ultimately acceptable because of his love for her. Had he actually come to recognize these things as wrong over the course of the story, then I would cut the Twilight romance a lot more slack than I do. The point is, in order to write a healthy enemies to lovers story, the fighting does need to stop before the romantic relationship officially begins. A more accurate name for this trope would really be enemies to allies to friends to lovers, but that doesn't really roll off the tongue in the same way. The actions that the characters take while they're still enemies will also have to be something that the relationship can recover from, because there should be lines that cannot be crossed. Now, what those lines are is going to vary depending on the story. For example, if in The Princess Diaries 2, Nicholas and his uncle had at some point kidnapped Mia or attempted to kill her, that would have been unforgivable, because those actions are in stark contrast with the lighter tone of the movie, and would mark him as a clear villain. However, in a story with much grayer morals and a darker setting, things like murder and kidnapping might very well be forgivable. Although the why and the who should definitely still factor into whether or not that's the case. Cutting someone down on the battlefield is going to be a lot different than bashing someone's head in with a croquet mallet over an old Super Bowl bet. I also feel like that was a very specific example, so again, to be very clear, I have never bashed anyone's head in, and I have never once watched the Super Bowl. If I even type the word into my phone, it autocorrects to superb owl, which does actually sound like something I would watch. So, to sum up, while I do understand and share the desire to promote healthy relationships in our fictional romances, Enemies to lovers is not an inherently toxic trope. It all depends on how it's written. Keep in mind the world and overall tone of your story when deciding which variant of the trope to use and how it's going to play out. Enemies to lovers is a trope that gives us beautiful stories of forgiveness and redemption, and I'm always going to love it for that. Now, I think I'm going to wrap it up there. Whatever your thoughts are on this trope, drop them in the comments down below, and tell me what your favorite enemies to lovers pairings are. Remember to give the video a like, and feel free to follow me on Instagram if you want a heads up on all my future videos. I also have cute cats who I post about on there, and occasionally I do cosplay too. So check it out if any of that appeals to you. Thanks again to all my new subscribers, stay brilliant, and I'll see you next time.